In this video, we're going to take a look at something called the Isosceles triangle theorem. So it has two parts. The first part tells us if we know sides are congruent, that'll tell us something about angles. The second part will be the converse. If we know something about angles, that will tell us something about sides. So the first part would say something like, say you have a triangle, like so, triangle ABC. The first part of this theorem would say if AB is congruent to BC, then angle A is congruent to angle C. So if you take a look at those sides, if these are congruent, the angle opposite each side are going to be congruent. We call those the base angles of an isosceles triangle. So essentially, if you have an isosceles triangle, your base angles are going to be congruent. The converse is also true. If angle A is congruent to angle C, then side AB is congruent to side BC. So if the angles are congruent, that tells us we can conclude we have an isosceles triangle. So the questions that you're going to see having to do with the isosceles triangle theorem, they're typically going to give you one or the other. Maybe some sides, and then they ask you to find some angles, or maybe some angles, and they might have you set up an equation or something to find some sides. So as a quick example, let's suppose I have a triangle, and they tell me that this side is 12, this side is 12, and let's make this angle 100 degrees. And they tell us find the values of x and y. But looking at that triangle, we've got two sides that are the same length. That means congruent. That tells us that the side opposite those congruent angles, or the angles opposite those congruent sides, I should say, are going to be congruent to each other. So y and x are going to have the same values. You might say, okay, well, that's great. They have the same values. How are we going to get them? Keep in mind all the angles in a triangle add to 180. So you've used up 100 degrees. You have 80 degrees left over to make up angles x and y. Well, that means y and x are both going to be exactly half of that. So x equals 40, y equals 40. Other questions they might give you. They might give you a triangle like this one and say that these angles are congruent and say that this side is 12 and this is x minus 2. And maybe this side is 15, who knows. Because these angles are congruent, that means the sides opposite those angles are also congruent. So you could set up an equation like 12 equals x minus 2. So you get 14 as the value of x. So those are the two main types of questions you're going to see with isosceles triangle theorem. We're going to prove the theorem in class together, and then we'll see how we might prove things using isosceles triangle theorem. That should do it for 4.6.